The story of the Angel of Death came to me through an elderly lady who had, as a kid, hung out in the cemetery, for want of a better term. She and her brother and cousin routinely went into the cemetery not to see death, but to collect fruit and food off of graves, which was not uncommon in that time frame. And it was during these little trips into the cemetery that they swore they'd come across what they called the angel, aka the Angel of Death. I believe that the people interviewed were convinced that they had seen death. I don't want to judge what they said, but they seemed to be quite convinced that what they had seen was the personification of death. They were quite adamant about what they had seen, and they described it as being a robed figure, taller than a normal heighted person, with a cape and a hood attached to the cape. The surface of the cloth on the figure was sort of a semi-matte satin finish, and it was black, and there was no face or hands or legs to speak of. She recalled never ever seeing anything like that. It was in some respects even creepier in that there was nothing they could really look into the eyes of or anything like that. The lady that I interviewed and her family members, I never got to take to the cemetery for them to show me the exact spot where they saw the ghost or the spirit or the entity, whatever it is. And so I was never really able to directly compare what customers on tours believe they've seen with the recollections of these people. But in a general sense, it seems that what customers and also locals and other visitors to the cemetery say they've seen does compare. I have to say that I often wondered whether the entity that these people believe they saw, whether it was deliberately a tailored down version or a slightly watered down version of what the Grim Reaper should look like. That is, it didn't have a skull or bony fingers or any of those long believed elements, and I wondered if maybe somehow it presented an image to kids which was not quite as terrifying. Mm-hmm. I honestly don't know whether this is the normal view of death or not, but I do think that it fitted the general belief of something kind of sinister. I have come across other stories of people who claim that they've seen death. A number of nurses working in hospitals, not just in Brisbane, but in other places such as Sydney, Hobart, one in Fremantle, who have told me of their experiences of working in a hospital and claiming that they had seen a robed figure standing at the foot of a bed of a patient that was either close to death or who had just died, and this figure would fade away, move away, disappear, vanish, almost within seconds of being sighted by. Sometimes people claim that they've seen death in other forms outside of the traditional figure of a robed creature with a skull and so on. And interestingly, in Brisbane, I've heard of an example of a lady who said that for several weeks she'd seen a motorised hearse parked outside in her street, outside a particular house, and thought it rather morbid that the undertaker would leave his car sitting out the front, and eventually the car disappeared, and it was on the day that she noticed the car disappeared, she learned that neighbour had died. She spoke to other neighbours that no one else had seen this car in the street, and so perhaps that was an example of death presenting itself in a different kind of way. And I have heard of other stories where death can come in the form of coaches, black cats, black-edged letters in the mail, where a person receives a letter telling them that such and such has died, and then I've only had one example of this, but where the letter then vanished, and the letter was there was no name on the letter as to who had sent it, and it later turned out that it would have been quite impossible for that letter to have been sent on the day that the person received it, because at that time their friend was still alive. I think death is dead. I think most people no longer believe in the idea at all of a creature coming for them and taking them away, which I think is quite sad. Modern society would much rather believe that death is merely a biological process, and that it's oxygen, cells no longer able to take up oxygen, and so therefore, and our body parts have worn out, and so then we just begin a sometimes rapid, often gradual process of decay until final physical death. Personally myself, I'd much rather that I wake up one morning and there's someone waiting at the foot of my bed that is quite clearly death, and who is pointing out the door and saying it's time to go. Although creepy, it's nice and final. I think we'll all have our own idea of what death will look like for us. It may be that once in childhood we read a book and we saw the image of the Grim Reaper, and we never think of it again until our dying day, but at that moment we'll see an image which reminds us that it's time to go. Or it may be some other reminder from during our life, a black cat, an animal, something else that will remind us it's time to go. I think, for me, I'm not quite sure what will come, but I'm sure it'll be bloody creepy.